Do you believe an invisible creature can save the heart of a lonely old woman? In the late 1980s, deep in the forgotten woods of Pine Hollow, Arkansas, a 71-year-old widow named Eleanor Nora Whitfield lived alone in a creaking cabin. No husband, no children, nothing but ticking clocks and cold silence. Until one stormy night, when a faint whimper echoed from her chicken coop. What she found wasn't human, not even animal, but she freed it from the trap anyway. By morning, the blood was gone, the trap disappeared, and someone had stacked fresh firewood on her porch. From that day on, her lonely life began to change. The stove lit itself, the windows shut before every storm, and one night, after a heart attack, Nora woke up under a warm blanket with giant footprints beside her bed. She was never alone again. This story comes from Nora's real, unfinished journal, found the morning she vanished without a trace. But 3 years later, a documentary crew accidentally filmed a towering figure cradling a woman in a blanket, vanishing into the mist. The tape stopped, but one retired ranger watched it and cried. "She was telling the truth," he whispered, "because sometimes kindness doesn't need proof. A single act of compassion can echo through the wild and come back when you need it most." Where are you watching from? How far can this story go? If this touched something in you, give it a like, subscribe, and help us build a community where Bigfoot isn't just a myth, but a memory shared by those who choose to believe. With love, from the forest to you. Late in the fall of 1987, the air in Pine Hollow turned heavy, soaked with the kind of silence that settles only when the world begins to forget you. The last leaves hung on like old promises, brown-edged and trembling in the wind that whispered down the ridgelines of the Ozarks. Fog rolled low and constant, clinging to the valley floor like breath that didn't know whether to stay or leave. In a clearing at the end of a long-forgotten trail, Eleanor Whitfield's cabin stood alone, half swallowed by ivy and memory. The house had once breathed laughter, built by hands that loved her. Boards cut clean and nailed firm by her husband Thomas, who'd split the logs himself, smoked his pipe on that porch through 3 wars and 2 floods. He died in that same chair 6 years earlier, and since then, time had eaten the place from the corners in. The roof sagged in spots, the front steps moaned like old knees, and the chimney leaked smoke into the rafters. But Nora stayed. She was 71 now, skin like creased paper and bones that counted every shift in the weather. She didn't need much, just the old quilt, the oil lamp, and the ticking of the wall clock that marked the rhythm of her waiting. Most nights, she spoke aloud to no one in particular. To Tom, to God, to the trees. She talked about the price of sugar going up, about the dreams she still had where her boy came back from Vietnam without the flag folded in a triangle, about how quiet the evenings got now, so quiet you could hear the frost forming on the windows. Then came that night. Rain had been falling steady since dusk, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on the tin roof like a warning. She'd almost drifted off in her rocker when the sound broke through. A cry, not loud, but urgent, wet and real. Not a fox, not a coyote. She knew those sounds. This was something else. She lit the lamp with shaking fingers and slipped on her coat, the one still holding Tom's scent in its collar. Out past the woodshed, behind the coop, her boots sank in mud and moss as she held the lamp high. The rain slapped against her skin. A second cry came, softer now, strained. Nora's breath caught. Near the wire fence, just outside the beam of the lantern, something moved. She stepped closer and saw it. A young creature, small, soaked, trembling. Its leg twisted in one of the old steel traps she thought she'd thrown out years ago. The trap had rusted into the earth, forgotten. But it hadn't forgotten how to hurt. At first, she froze. The thing wasn't a dog, not a raccoon, and it wasn't human either. But it was close. Too close. Its face was covered in wet, fine fur, but skin showed underneath. thin patches, almost bluish from cold. Its eyes, oh God, those eyes, amber and wide, shimmering with pain and trust at once. No growl, no scream. It just looked at her. Nora knelt, heart hammering, soaked through to her bones. Her hands worked from memory, not courage. She unwrapped the scarf from her neck, spoke in a whisper like one might to a baby or a dying man, and slipped the blade of the hatchet between the trap's teeth. It took 3 tries. The metal finally gave with a snap, and the little creature let out a sound. Not quite relief, not quite fear. She reached toward it, but before her fingers touched its fur, it jerked back, limping hard into the dark, vanishing into the trees without another sound. The only thing left behind was a streak of blood in the dirt, and a small silver bracelet, still warm, glinting beneath the coop's slanted roof. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, the rain had stopped. Fog pressed against the windows like an old friend leaning too close. When Nora stepped outside, the trap was gone. No prints, no drag marks, nothing. The blood, too, had vanished from the earth. But there, on the porch step, a neat stack of firewood stood, freshly split. She hadn't cut that much in weeks. A hush fell over her heart, a hush that felt like something watching, not to harm, but to listen. The bracelet lay on the table beside her tea that morning. It bore a symbol she didn't recognize. 3 intersecting lines, curved like vines. But it had been cleaned, polished to a brightness she hadn't seen in years. She turned it over in her fingers all day, then left it there, just in case something came looking for it again. Each morning after that, the firewood was replenished. Her chicken coop, usually a daily battle with frost, remained thawed, dry. Her water troughs, even during the cold snap that curled the creek into brittle silence, never froze solid. She told herself it was the wind, a trick of light. But her heart wasn't built for lies. Then came the night the storm hit hard. She'd been carrying a basket of eggs into the house when her knees gave out. The pain in her chest came sharp and sudden. She collapsed beside the wood pile, the world going sideways, black at the edges. She didn't remember falling. Only the thunder cracking open the sky. When she came to, she was inside, wrapped in her blanket, fire blazing in the hearth. The eggs were gone, none broken, and her slippers had been set beside the rocker. The lamp was lit, and on the floor, just past the hearth's edge, a single footprint the size of a cast-iron skillet glistened in the firelight. Pressed deep into the old pine boards, the water from melted snow pooled inside it. It pointed toward the front door. After that, she stopped locking it. She began to speak to the space around her, not in fear, in gratitude. She set out a tin of cornbread some nights, left the lantern burning a little longer. When she swept, she left the footprint alone, let it stain the wood like a memory. Then came the snow, the real snow. It blanketed Pine Hollow in white silence, so thick it buried fences, swallowed paths. Nora woke one morning to find not just more wood, but something else waiting on the porch. A basket, woven from reeds she didn't recognize. Inside, strips of dried meat, 2 small root bulbs, and a bunch of herbs she remembered from childhood, used in poultices and wound cleaning. Slippery elm, bone set, something else, something rare, the kind you didn't find anymore. Nestled atop it all was the silver bracelet. This time it glowed. Nora brought it inside, placed it gently in the drawer next to her wedding ring and the locket with Tom's picture. Her fingers trembled when she closed it, not from fear, from awe. She stood at the window that night, looking out across the snow-choked clearing. For a moment, something moved at the tree line, a tall shape, still and quiet, watching. She didn't raise her lantern, didn't speak, but she nodded, and the shape disappeared into the woods. In the days that followed, the woods whispered differently, not like loneliness anymore, but like a secret being kept just for her. And when the wind knocked her gloves off the porch rail and snow began to fall heavy again, she found them the next morning, dry, warm, and folded neatly beside the stove. She smiled. Not everything that walks in the dark means harm. Some things come because we listened once, long ago, when they cried. And we answered. That winter had only just begun, but something had already shifted in the rhythm of her days. In the corner of the cabin, the woodpile grew taller than it ever had before. In her chest, the silence no longer ached the way it used to. Something had come in from the trees, not just for shelter, but for something older than survival, for the memory of kindness, for a debt that only the forest could repay. And though the night returned again and again, and though the wind scratched at the window panes, Eleanor Whitfield no longer waited for the end. She had already been found, and something out there, something too large for language, was keeping watch. Winter arrived like an old grief returning, quiet, cold, and without asking permission. By early December, the trees around Pine Hollow stood bare as bones, their black limbs scratching the gray sky, while frost clung to the window panes of Nora's cabin like fingerprints left by ghosts. The woods didn't whisper anymore. They waited. The kind of waiting that presses against the chest and fills the corners of a house until you're no longer sure if it's silence or company. Every morning, Nora stepped out onto the creaking porch before the sun climbed high enough to melt the rimed steps. The air bit through her flannel coat, but her breath came steady, even if the rest of her no longer did. Her bones ached more lately. Her hands, once sure, trembled just a little when lighting the stove. But each day when she opened the door, a new stack of dry split wood greeted her, stacked precisely the way Tom used to do, bark side down, the top row cross-laid for breathing room. She hadn't split a log herself in weeks. The strange part wasn't the wood. It was the fact that it was never wet. Not once. Not a drop of snow or frost ever touched it. Like someone, or something, had carried it under cover through the night and left it in perfect order before the dawn. Inside, the fire was always burning low but steady. Sometimes she'd wake in the dark, heart fluttering from a dream she couldn't quite hold on to, and realize the embers were glowing again, even if she'd let them die before bed. It made no sense. Nothing in her aching body could have gotten up without her knowing. But she never felt afraid. Something was watching over her. That much was clear. Some mornings, she found the hens still tucked in their coop, but the feed had been refreshed. A single feather left on the windowsill. No tracks, no prints. Just the work done. She started talking to the empty rooms. Not the way people talk to themselves when they're lonely. It was more like thanking a guest who never showed their face. She'd nod toward the fireplace, set an extra mug on the table. Sometimes she'd leave a folded cloth or a tin of lard bread by the door. Nothing extravagant, just a gesture, a kindness in return. And the gestures came back. One evening just after sundown, she brought in the chickens like always. The snow had started to fall again, soft but steady. Her heart had been giving her trouble for a few days. A flutter, a tightness, like something winding itself too tight inside her chest. She bent to pick up the pail of eggs, and the world tilted hard to the left. Her knees buckled. The pail dropped. Then the darkness opened up beneath her. When she came to, the first thing she noticed was the smell of burning cedar. The second was the quilt, the old one with the blue border her mother had sewn, tucked gently around her shoulders. The third was the fire, alive and strong, licking high in the stove, snapping like it knew what had almost happened. Her eyes drifted to the floor. There, pressed into the pine just inches from her chair, was a footprint. Large, wet, and unmistakably not human. No shoe tread, no boot mark. Just a wide, bare impression with 5 long toes and thick pads. Almost like a man's, but broader, heavier. The water still clung to the boards around it, seeping slowly into the grain. It faced toward the hearth. She didn't cry. Not then. But her hands clutched the quilt tighter. She whispered, "Thank you," into the hush of the room, and the fire crackled back. That night, she didn't sleep in the bedroom. She stayed in the rocker, wrapped up, watching the light shift along the walls until morning. It was the safest she'd felt in years. 3 days later, the snow came hard, the kind that silenced everything. No birdsong, no creak of trees, just white. When she opened the door that morning, a basket sat at her feet, not a store-bought one. This was handmade, woven tight from river reeds and lined with something soft and mossy. Inside were bundles wrapped in birch bark, small, neat, fragrant. She opened the first one. Her fingers knew the scent before her eyes registered it. Wild yarrow, slippery elm, boneset, old medicine, the kind mountain women had once taught her mother to use. The kind nobody used anymore because it had to be found, not bought. The kind that healed deep wounds. The kind that didn't always show on the outside. Her breath caught. She opened another bundle. Tucked inside was a strip of dried meat, still warm, and beside it, placed so carefully it looked ceremonial, lay the silver bracelet, the same one she'd found near the trap weeks ago. It had been polished. The strange symbol, those 3 arched lines like interwoven roots, gleamed clearly now, almost etched rather than engraved. The metal felt warm in her hand, like it had been resting near a fire. She stood there on the porch for a long time, wind whipping her hair around her face, snow gathering at her feet, the cold biting her cheeks. But her hand stayed still. No trembling. Something had chosen her. That afternoon, she placed the bracelet beside Tom's photo. She didn't put it away. She didn't want to. Later, as dusk swallowed the hollow, she lit the lantern and placed it by the window, leaving it burning well past the hour she normally would. She made 2 cups of tea, one for herself. One she set across the table, steam rising. She didn't say anything, just sat, rocked, waited. And outside, beyond the ring of yellow light, the trees stood still, but not silent. Not anymore. When she awoke the next morning, the second mug was empty. Not spilled, just drained. There was a soft smear of dirt near the base of the chair across from her. Not a footprint this time, just the outline of something sitting, knees drawn high, watching her sleep. It didn't scare her. It humbled her. And that day, for the first time in years, she opened the back door and left it ajar. Just a crack, just enough. That same evening, as the snow began to fall again, she went to hang her gloves on the porch rail to dry after washing them. A habit. 2 hours later, when she went to fetch them, they were gone. She looked around. Nothing. She checked again at bedtime. There, beside the stove, folded neatly on the bench, were her gloves. Dry, warm. The fabric puffed and soft, like they'd been held over steady heat. Not a speck of snow on them. She sat on the edge of the bench for a long while, staring at the gloves. Then she whispered into the room, voice steady, "You didn't have to." And somewhere just beyond the walls, in the hush of trees and snow and wind, something shifted. A branch creaked, not broken but bent, and the air in the cabin thickened like breath caught in the throat. That night she didn't light the lantern. She left it dark on purpose. She wanted to see better. She wanted them to know they didn't have to hide. And as the wind howled over the ridge and the chimney smoked slow and warm, Nora Whitfield sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, and waited. Not for death anymore, not for Tom, not for the end, but for the next moment, the next gift, the next sign that something in this world, no matter how strange, how quiet, how wild, still believed in mercy. And in the dark, something listened. Winter deepened like a breath held too long. By the second week of January, the snow in Pine Hollow lay thick enough to silence even the bravest footsteps, burying the fence posts and old wheelbarrow in Nora's yard like forgotten bones. The wind no longer moved freely between the trees. It curled through the forest with weight, as though it carried the memory of all things unsaid. Inside the cabin, the fire whispered steadily, casting gold across the floorboards. And yet, that night, the stillness broke. It was close to midnight when Nora heard it again. A thin, ragged sound beneath the wind. Something straining to be brave, but failing. She rose slowly, joints protesting the cold that seeped into her knees, and eased open the door. The snow came down in quiet sheets, and the fog pressed close, muting even the sound of her breath. But there, just beneath the overhang, curled beneath the warped bench, were two small shapes. They were soaked through, shivering against one another. Little bodies hunched low, fur slicked and clinging, eyes wide and glinting in the faint lantern light. They didn't move. They didn't cry, just trembled. Nora didn't speak, didn't gasp. Her heart dropped low in her chest like a stone settling into riverbed, but her hands moved without thought. She turned, grabbed the extra blanket from the peg, laid it across them. Then she stepped back into the house, tore the last of the cornbread into uneven halves, and brought it out, kneeling slowly on the wet wood. She set the pieces down with care and waited. The larger of the two sniffed first, then the other. Tentative, slow. Their fingers were long, human-shaped but thicker at the joints, with nails dulled not by trimming, but by use. One took the bread and passed it gently to the other, who stared at Nora for a beat too long before chewing. Cautious, almost ashamed. Nora's throat tightened. The snow fell heavier. She said nothing, only watched as they huddled again beneath the bench, arms wrapped around each other, their movements careful and learned. She left the door unlatched that night, just in case. By morning they were gone. Only a smear of melted snow and the empty plate remained, but their scent lingered in the air. Wet cedar, old soil, something wild but not threatening. Nora kept her eyes on the tree line all day. Around dusk, just before the blue hour turned the snow to iron, she caught sight of him, far beyond the yard's edge, standing still among the pines, a figure as tall as the shed and nearly as wide. Broad-shouldered, dark-furred, with arms that hung long and loose at his sides. He didn't move, didn't step closer, but even from that distance, she felt the gaze, steady, aware. He didn't blink. Nora stood at the porch, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her breath curling upward like smoke. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. The message passed in silence. She understood. This was their father, the same creature she'd freed weeks ago from the rusted trap, when her fear hadn't been strong enough to outweigh her instinct to protect. The same presence that had since watched over her without ever asking anything in return. Now, here he was, standing guard at the edge of the world. Not for himself, but for the ones too small to defend themselves. His children. Nora's chest hurt in a different way now. Not the sharp pull of heartache, but a slow, building ache of recognition. But peace, like fire in the wind, never holds for long. 2 days later, someone knocked on her door. It was Calvin Reed, the county deputy, a man built like an axe handle and just about as friendly. His breath clouded the air when he spoke, and his eyes were more restless than usual, darting to the trees behind her like they were listening. "Miss Whitfield," he said, doffing his cap out of habit more than respect. "You heard anything strange lately?" Nora didn't flinch. "The wind howls. That's not strange." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We found another calf torn up over at Harris's. That makes 4 this month. Something spooking the livestock." He paused, then leaned in a fraction too far. "You been seeing anything out here? Big tracks? Anything odd?" She met his stare with the kind of calm only age could earn. "There's plenty odd in these hills. Always has been. But odd don't mean dangerous." His jaw tightened. "Well, dangerous or not, I'm telling folks to keep an eye out. Could be a bear. Might even be a rogue cat. Either way, best you keep that rifle close." She didn't tell him the rifle hadn't been loaded in years. He glanced past her again, to the woods, where the snow blurred the trees together in dense white silence. "I'm just trying to keep people safe, ma'am." She nodded. "So am I." That night, when she swept the porch, she found brass casings buried in the snow near the edge of the yard. 3 of them. Fresh. She looked toward the trees and felt her stomach twist. Someone had been hunting, and not deer. Inside, her gloves, the ones she'd hung earlier that morning, were gone from the rail. She didn't even think to look for them. But when she came back into the kitchen, there they were, folded neatly on the bench, warm and dry. No note, just care. And that care didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt deliberate, sympathetic. Nora sat down at the table, placed a hand over the gloves, and closed her eyes. Whatever lived out there, whatever knew this house, this land, this woman, had begun to understand her too. But that didn't mean the world around them would. The next morning, she walked the edge of the clearing with a shovel. No one asked her to. She did it out of instinct. The snow was soft, easy to dig through, and she worked slow but steady, making sure the line near the woodshed was cleared down to soil. By noon, she had carved out a shallow hollow beneath the floorboards of the old smokehouse, just large enough to hold 2 small bodies curled tight. She laid pine needles inside, then a tarp, then folded wool blankets. She left the door open just enough for small fingers to slip through. A hiding place, just in case, because something in her gut told her Calvin wasn't done sniffing. That night, when she turned in early, exhausted and sore, she heard them again. Footsteps, not loud, but purposeful, pacing the porch. Then the soft creak of the bench, like weight settling down. She didn't move. Just let the fire keep burning. Let them rest. But in the darkness beyond the glass, far out where the snow met the trees, she could feel him standing again. Watching, waiting. The father, keeping vigil while the world slept and danger prowled closer. And for the first time in decades, Nora didn't feel like the only one left holding a secret too big to tell. Something had come full circle in that hollow. But the circle was fragile. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the sound of gunmetal being loaded into cold hands whispered louder than the wind. The cold had settled in like a curse no one dared name. By February, Pine Hollow didn't look like a place where anything kind had ever happened. The trees stood bare and black as burnt matches, the ground frozen so hard the creaks hissed like bone when the ice cracked. Snow drifted up to the window sills, and even the wind stopped howling. It just breathed heavy through the timber like it was tired of warning anyone. That kind of cold made folks superstitious, gave shape to things in the dark. And in a place as small as this, where stories traveled faster than trucks, fear needed only a whisper to catch fire. It started with a calf, then another. By the 4th, no one in the valley was shrugging anymore. The last one was found not far from the fence that bordered old Miss Whitfield's place. Neck tangled in rusted barbed wire, eyes wide and glazed, legs bent wrong. But no bite marks, no blood, just panic. Deep claw marks in the dirt, hooves scraped raw from thrashing. It hadn't been eaten, just chased, scared to death. The ranchers blamed coyotes, or a cougar. Calvin Reed blamed what he didn't want to say out loud, and that silence made it worse. By week's end, folks were muttering about the woods behind Nora's cabin. "She's seen it, I know it. Something ain't right up there. Ain't been for years. They say she talks to it. She feeds it." Nora heard them. She always did. It was in the way people glanced down when she came into the post office. How conversations cut off sharp like a radio dialed down too fast. But she kept her head high, basket looped firm over her arm. She didn't answer their fear because fear doesn't listen. And she wasn't going to hand out pieces of the truth to people who didn't know how to hold it. But Calvin wasn't like the others. He didn't whisper. He came straight to her door with mud on his boots and suspicion in his jaw. "They think you're hiding something," he said. Not unkindly, not kindly either. Nora stood in the doorway, the light from inside pooling behind her like warm honey. Her eyes were steady. "Am I?" He shifted his weight, glanced toward the tree line. "You ever see anything back there?" She didn't answer. Tracks, sounds, still nothing. "You believe in monsters, Miss Whitfield?" That made her smile, but only a little. "I believe in what I've seen." He waited for more. She didn't give it. "I'm organizing a search," he finally said. "Few of the boys. Maybe bring some dogs, just to be safe." "You bringing guns?" He didn't blink. "We'll be prepared." "For what?" He didn't answer either. That night, they combed the woods with flashlights and shotguns, crunching through snow like they were storming a battlefield. They didn't find tracks, not real ones. But they found something near the northern ridge. A broken fence post, a smear of blood on the bark. And just beyond that, nestled in the low thicket, the calf. Not torn, not chewed, just dead. And that was enough. The news spread by sunrise. They called it a beast. They called it hers. At the diner, someone said she was a witch. At the feed store, someone swore they saw a shape at her window. And that afternoon, while she walked the path back from town, Calvin stopped her, right in the middle of the road. His truck idled behind him. His eyes didn't waver. "You need to come clean." Nora didn't flinch. "About what?" "Whatever's out there, whatever you're protecting." "I'm protecting what never asked to be hunted." "That's not up to you." "Isn't it?" she asked, voice flat. "If the law no longer remembers mercy, then maybe it is." That night, as the snow came down hard enough to blind the hills, Nora stepped out to the porch, breath curling up into the black like a last prayer. She held her lantern high. The wind caught her coat, lifted the hem like fingers pulling at memory. And across the open field, she saw it. Not the creature, the men. Their flashlights danced along the trees. Guns drawn, boots crunching too loud, too careless, looking for proof they'd already decided they'd find. And just beyond them, standing still as a broken statue, was the tall shadow she knew by now like her own reflection in lake water. He wasn't moving, he was guarding. And she knew in that moment he wasn't guarding himself. He was drawing their eyes, keeping them away. Her eyes filled, not with fear, but with something deeper, a knowing, an ache that had no word. She left the lantern on the railing and went inside. On the kitchen table, laid without sound, was a scrap of paper. Not torn, not old, not hers. She stared at it for a long time. It was from Tom's journal. She recognized the curve of the corner, the faded ink at the top, the words written across it in a bold hand she didn't recognize. "Don't shoot what's been saving you." She sat down, the paper trembling in her hands. That meant something had been inside, not just watching, searching, and it knew what mattered. When she reached for her gloves, left out again on the windowsill earlier that evening, they were gone. But the stove had been stoked. The kettle was warm. The fire new. The wind howled once, like a warning too late. And somewhere out beyond the fields, gunshots cracked the night like a chain snapping in half. The dogs barked. The men shouted. Then silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes when something ancient lifts its head and decides enough is enough. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered to the dark, "Whatever happens now, I'm still with you." The fire snapped behind her, and outside the snow kept falling, covering tracks, covering truth. But not hiding it. Not really. Because truth, no matter how strange, doesn't stay buried when the forest remembers. Under the thick blanket of February snow, the trees of Pine Hollow stood like sentries in mourning, tall and still, holding their breath. The wind had changed again. Not colder. Colder was something Nora had made peace with, but heavier, as if something deeper had entered the valley. Something watching, weighing, waiting. In her chest, she felt it before she understood it. A pull. A tether. She spent mornings checking the wood pile, touching the gloves she found folded warm by the fire, brushing her hand across the scarf on the peg like she might touch a memory. But it was more than memory now. There was presence. And that presence was no longer distant. It was near. Closer than breath. She knew, without needing to see, that the children still came, quiet, careful, always at night. She left a shallow metal pan beneath the porch filled with scraps. The next morning, it was always licked clean, not by a raccoon or stray dog. She'd know the difference. The tracks were wide, but light, and the way they moved, like someone learning how to be invisible, but not yet grown enough to disappear fully. She added extra blankets to the smokehouse crawl space, checked it daily, restuffed the cedar bedding, sometimes found it disturbed, slightly warm. One day, she swore she heard a cough from below the boards, not a sound of illness, a child's cough, quick, shallow, startled. That was the same day she found the dead crow. It lay on her porch railing, wings splayed but unbroken, eyes black and glassy, beak parted slightly. No sign of blood, just stillness. In its mouth was a pine needle, stiff and green. And under the crow, pinned beneath its limp weight, was a folded length of burlap string. A warning, she didn't know from whom, or to whom. She burned the crow before dusk, whispering a psalm she only half remembered, and locked every window for the first time in months. That night she didn't sleep. By morning she knew why. Sometime between the dark and dawn, one of them had been caught. The snow outside the chicken coop was painted with something darker than shadow, streaks of red across white, like spilled paint dragged by panic. Her breath hitched as she followed the trail past the broken fence, to the edge of the woods, where it simply ended. Not a body, not a sound. But near the garden bed, crushed into the frost, was a trap. Old, large, military grade. Teeth rusted but sharp. The same kind Calvin had used to line the far field when the coyotes were thick years ago. And stuck between the jaws was a single tuft of fur. Coarse, dark brown, still warm when she touched it. She dropped to her knees, not out of panic, out of urgency. She didn't scream. She didn't call out. She moved, quick, with the strength of something primal. She lifted the trap, fought it open with an old fence post, and took the fur inside, cleaned the blood from her porch, lit the stove higher, then grabbed what she could, linen, rubbing alcohol, honey, salt, and went back out, boots crunching hard against the ice. She followed nothing but instinct, straight into the woods, toward the old maple with the hollow trunk, the one Tom used to call the silence tree. It was there she stopped, waited, knees down in the snow, and when the figure came limping through the trees, small, hunched, arm held awkward against its side. She didn't cry. She whispered, "Come here, baby," like she had 100 times before, to a boy she once rocked in his fever, who never made it home from the jungle. The creature, no taller than her hip, staggered once, then collapsed against her chest. It didn't weigh much, but in that moment, it held every burden she'd tried to bury for decades. She didn't carry it. She shielded it. As the lights came through the trees, flashlights, voices, men, Nora turned, slow and deliberate, still crouched. She heard boots. Snow crushed hard. Breath clouds. Then Calvin's voice, sharp and cutting. "Step away, Nora." She didn't. "I said move." He was closer now, 30 feet, maybe 20. She reached down, pressing both hands over the bleeding creature's ribs. It shivered, eyes wide but silent. It didn't fight. Calvin stepped into view. His gun was already drawn. Her voice came low, steady. "It's just a child." He didn't lower the weapon. "I'm warning you." "No, Calvin," she said, eyes locked to his. "I'm warning you." He raised the barrel, then pulled the trigger. The crack split the air. The pain bloomed fast and hot across her shoulder. She didn't fall, not all the way. Just sank slightly, teeth clenched, one hand jerking toward the wound. The other stayed firm on the child's back. Calvin froze. "Nora, damn it!" But another sound drowned him out. A growl, not an animal's, something deeper. Then movement, fast, heavy, towering. From the left it came. a blur of fur and muscle, arms outstretched, face bared but not snarling. It didn't strike. It shielded, planted itself between Nora and the gun. Calvin staggered back, dropped his flashlight. The creature stood over 8 feet tall. Its chest heaved. Steam rose from its shoulders. Snow clung to the coarse fur along its legs, but the face, that face, was exposed to the light. Not an ape, not a mask. A man, a wild man, with eyes the color of firelight and a mouth set in sorrow, not rage. It reached back, one arm curling around the child still beneath Nora's protection. Then it turned toward the deputy and waited. The gun didn't rise again. Instead, Calvin lowered his arm. Slow, deliberate, like a man setting down a lie he could no longer carry. "I didn't mean," he began. But the forest didn't care for apologies. Behind them, more voices. Neighbors, dogs barking. Nora felt the warmth fade beneath her hand. She turned. The smaller creature was gone. No tracks, only snow disturbed in a perfect hollow, like something had been lifted into air. The tall one followed, stepping back into shadow, lifting its child against its chest with an ease that spoke of love, not flight, and in seconds they disappeared. Only Nora remained, bleeding into the snow. By the time the neighbors arrived, Calvin had holstered his weapon and was kneeling beside her. He said nothing, just pressed a bandana to her wound. She didn't speak either. The look in her eyes said everything. You broke something, and it will not return the same. Dawn came slow that morning, like the world wasn't sure it wanted to wake. The snow outside had turned gray, dense, the kind that swallows light instead of reflecting it. The chimney stood cold. No smoke, no sound. The birds were gone too. Only the faint drip of thawing icicles echoed against the porch railing, steady as a clock that had forgotten the hour. Inside the cabin, the fire was out, the kettle empty, the chair by the window still rocking slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. But Eleanor Whitfield was gone. The neighbors found the place first, after the trail of blood froze halfway down the path behind the coop. It wasn't much, just small dots that faded near the back door, then disappeared entirely. The sheriff came next, then Calvin, his coat half-buttoned, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. He hadn't said much since that night. He'd told the others it had all happened too fast, that he'd seen something inhuman leap from the trees, that he fired out of fear, that the snow swallowed everything before he could breathe twice. But now, standing in that doorway, gun still at his side, he felt the truth pressing in like the cold itself. He didn't shoot to protect anyone. He shot because he couldn't understand mercy when it didn't look like him. He called out her name into the still cabin. Nothing answered. On the table, an open notebook sat beneath the window light. Her handwriting, shaky but neat, filled only half a page. The rest was blank. "If they come again, don't be afraid," she had written. "They don't hate, they remember." Beside it was a folded napkin, wrapped around the silver bracelet, polished to a shine, as though someone had taken time to clean it one last time. The symbol in the center glinted faintly under the pale light. 3 lines intertwined. Roots, branches, connection. Calvin picked it up carefully, thumb tracing the grooves. It was warm, impossibly warm, even in that frigid room. He looked toward the hearth. The ashes were cold, but the smell of cedar lingered, faint but present, as if someone had burned it only hours ago. He called again, softer this time. "Nora." Outside, the snow held strange patterns. Not quite footprints. Too large, too deliberate. The drifts were pressed down in a long, even path leading toward the woods. And there, where the path met the tree line, something else. The outline of a hand, enormous, pressed flat into the crusted snow, fingers splayed wide like a promise not to be forgotten. Mary Connell arrived just after noon. She was still wearing her scrubs, hair pinned up under a knit cap, her car tires buried nearly to the rims in the road. She was the town's veterinarian, and Nora's only real friend these past few years. The kind of friendship born not of company, but of shared loneliness. She didn't wait for Calvin's explanation. She walked in slow, eyes already glistening, then found the journal. She read it standing by the window, the light trembling across the words. "If they come again, don't be afraid." Her breath hitched. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest. Calvin spoke without turning. "You think they took her?" Mary shook her head. "I think she left with them." He frowned. "Why the hell would she do that?" "Because she trusted them more than us." He didn't answer. The words hung heavy between them. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere deep in the valley, a tree cracked under the weight of ice. A sound like a rifle in the distance. Both of them flinched. By evening, word had spread. The widow Whitfield had vanished. Some said she wandered off and froze. Others said the beast took her. The braver ones claimed she'd been buried in the snow. But when Calvin led the search party that night, their lanterns weaving through the timber, they found something none of them could explain. Near the wooden footbridge that crossed Pine Creek, the snow was pressed flat in a long trail, not from boots, not from paws, but from something being carried. The impression was deep in places, shallow in others, like the burden had been shifted between more than one pair of hands. No drag marks, no blood, just the faint imprint of bare feet, one human, one not. They ended halfway across the bridge. Calvin stood there for a long time, staring at that last step before the drop. The creek below had thawed slightly, mist rising off the dark water. The moonlight turned it silver. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something moving across the opposite bank, tall, broad, covered in shadow. But when he blinked, it was gone. Mary didn't follow the others back. She stayed behind, kneeling near the bridge. Something caught her eye among the reeds. A piece of cloth, wool, torn from a coat, caught on a branch. She picked it up. It was the same brown as the cardigan Nora always wore, and woven into the tear was a single strand of dark hair, thick, coarse, and too long to be human. When she turned it over in her hand, a single drop of water fell from it, though it hadn't snowed in hours. She whispered to the wind, "You took care of her, didn't you?" The forest gave no reply, but the air shifted, warmer for just a moment, like breath against her cheek. Back in town, the cabin was sealed off. The sheriff wrote his report with the usual words: disappearance, unknown circumstances, presumed hypothermia. Calvin signed his name beneath it, though his hand shook so hard the ink bled across the paper. He didn't sleep that night. When he finally did, he dreamed of her, standing at the edge of the woods, smiling, hand raised as if to forgive him. And behind her, half hidden in the mist, a figure too tall for the trees. Weeks passed. Then spring arrived, reluctant but sure. Snow melted into the soil, and the valley breathed again. The cabin stayed empty, though sometimes travelers said they saw smoke curling from the chimney on cold mornings. Others said they heard a woman humming somewhere beyond the ridge, an old tune about home. Mary went up once more in late March, alone. The air was soft with rain, the earth thawed and rich. She walked through the garden, now wild with green shoots, and into the house. Dust floated in the slanted light, but everything felt tended. The floor swept, the table clean, and on the window ledge, a fresh sprig of pine. She found another note tucked inside the open drawer. The same handwriting, but steadier this time, as if written by someone no longer in pain. The forest loves who loves it back. Mary smiled through her tears. She left the door open when she went. Just a crack. Down by the river, a fisherman swore later that day he saw a tall shape carrying something wrapped in a blanket through the shallows, moving slow, careful, like it was cradling something fragile. When he told it in town, nobody believed him. They said it was the mist playing tricks. But Calvin believed. He didn't admit it out loud. He didn't have to, He went back to the cabin one last time before leaving his badge on the desk for good. He walked through every room, touching the walls, the chair, the kitchen table where she'd sat all those mornings talking to something only she could see. Then he stopped by the window, staring out across the trees. The sun was setting low, orange bleeding into blue, and for the first time in months, the wind carried something soft, like laughter too far away to catch. When he turned to leave, he noticed something carved into the mantel above the hearth. He ran his hand across it slowly. Loved by the wild. The letters were clean, fresh, too precise to have been done by hand. He didn't ask how. He stepped out onto the porch, eyes stinging from the wind. The forest stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. But somewhere beneath it, a heartbeat still pulsed. Quiet, steady, ancient. He could almost hear it. Could almost see her there, walking between the trees, not gone, just elsewhere. He left the door unlatched when he walked away. That night, as the valley darkened, the sound of water running under ice echoed down the hollow. And far beyond, deep in the woods, a low, rumbling sound rolled through the pines. Not grief, not warning, just a promise kept. By the time 3 winters had come and gone without her, Pine Hollow learned how to say her name in a lower voice. People still pointed at the cabin when they drove the gravel road that skirts the creek, but the pointing turned into a small, private gesture, the way folks touch their chest in church when a hymn hits a tender place. Weather wore the porch smooth and eased the sharpness off the gossip. The first year they blamed the cold, the second they blamed the woods. By the third, they started to blame themselves in the quiet, and that changed how the valley listened to the wind. Spring took longer that year. Rime held on under the north faces, and the creek ran black and fast with snowmelt. In late April, a white van with a dish on the roof came rattling up from the highway and parked near the old footbridge where the mist likes to sit. The logo on the door wasn't one the town recognized, just the kind of modern letters that made the diner crowd shake their heads and say, television folks were sniffing around again. A crew stepped out with tripods and hard cases, city shoes sinking into mud, faces turned up to gauge the light. They moved with the restless pace of people who think they're late to something that might not exist. They had called ahead, a polite voice on a long-distance line, asking if a documentary about the Ozark ecosystem could shoot a bit around Pine Hollow, maybe capture the spring thaw, the timber regrowth, the slow return of birds to the cut-over hills. No one mentioned her name, not in the call. But when the van pulled in beside the bridge, the producer stood a long time with his hands in his pockets, staring into the trees as if he'd already been told a story and was waiting to hear it repeat itself. Calvin Reed saw the van go by and didn't turn away like he used to. He'd taken off the badge the spring after she vanished, set it on the sheriff's desk with a note that said he needed a quieter kind of honesty than the job allowed. He kept the old truck in a small apartment above the feed store, worked some shifts at the lumber yard, and mostly stayed out of people's way. He had let his hair grow out around the ears. It made him look younger from a distance and older up close. When the van passed the storefront window, the bell on the feed store door rang behind him, and he stepped out into the raw morning, hands cold, breath visible. He watched the road until the van disappeared into the low wash of fog near the creek. Then he turned his collar up and told himself it was none of his business. That lie didn't hold 50 yards. The crew asked around town for a guide. They were pointed to Mary Connell because Mary knows the ridge paths the way other people know hymns by heart. She agreed on one condition: no trespassing at the cabin and no digging along the tree roots that hold the bank by the bridge. They smiled, said sure, said they had permits for the county land and only wanted the long shots anyway. She nodded and told them what time the light thinned out enough to turn mist into lace. They set the camera on the bridge rail just before noon, where the planks creak in the middle. The operator cupped his hands around the lens to cut the glare. The producer held his headset down with one palm and said something about rolling B-roll, about cutaways and transitions, and how the river makes any story sound truer than it is. The sound guy lifted his boom and leaned his whole body toward the water, listening for the kind of quiet that registers as a noise on tape. The director pointed to a spot upriver where the current slows, asked the operator to hold there for a breath, then drift left, then pan down. If you were close enough to hear them, you could tell they were proud of how patient they were being. The fog took a breath and thickened, and the creek shrugged up a little rise of water the way it does when a branch slips free upriver. The operator's eye never left the viewfinder. He murmured, "There's movement." Everyone stilled, heads angled into the cold so their ears could catch what their eyes were afraid to admit. The director leaned over the monitor. There, between the two cedar trunks on the far bank, a shadow stepped into the open water, slow, careful, the way you carry something you can't afford to drop. It was tall enough to make the cedars look thinner, broad enough that the fog folded around it like a curtain going shy. In its arms, held high to keep from the spray, was a shape wrapped in a wool blanket, edges dark with moisture. The camera operator whispered a word he wouldn't say in church. The director told him to hold steady. The producer made the smallest sound, not fear, not triumph, recognition, like he had been expecting this and hoping he was wrong. The shape moved through the shallows in a diagonal line, every step deliberate. When the figure turned a fraction toward the lens, the operator flinched and then recovered, because for the half-breath that face was there, it fit nowhere their city minds could file it. Not an ape, not a mask. A human-like wild man face, intelligent in the set of the eyes and the soft restraint of the mouth. Amber catching the thin light like coals taking breath. Skin showed beneath the thin facial fur, and a short beard blended softly into the rest. No snout, nothing animal about the gaze. It fell across the camera like the gaze of someone who knows exactly what you are, and can forgive you for it if you don't aim to harm. The tape shivered. The operator hissed that he was losing sync. The battery was fine, the meter was fine, something else was wrong. The sound man tilted the boom, and what he caught was not footsteps or water alone, but a low harmonic under the world, like when a freight train is still 2 hills away and the ground starts to hum because it knows before you do. The figure lifted the bundle a little higher. The blanket shifted, and for a heartbeat you could swear you saw a thin hand slip free. Long fingers, a small palm pressing back against the chest of the one who carried it. Then the fog folded, the lens veiled, and the monitor bloomed white for 3 full seconds before it snapped back to gray. When the picture returned, the water ran empty. The opposite bank showed only the long alder roots like knuckles. The crew remained very still, the way animals go still when they understand they are being watched from a distance they can't measure. Mary did not speak. She had moved a step back from the rail without realizing it, one hand on the bridge post, the other pressed flat against her stomach as if to keep something tender inside from breaking. She looked at the director and shook her head once, very small, as if to say, "You saw enough." They packed up fast, too fast, the way people who have to walk past a graveyard at night decide to jog the last block for no reason they will ever admit. They didn't talk much on the way back to town. The producer made one call from the diner payphone, coins clacking into the slot, and said terms like uplink and window and affiliate, while his eyes stayed fixed on the far windows where the ridges sat like folded paper. They got 3 usable seconds in the edit. The rest strobed, ghosted, bled. The machines at the station gave them error codes that the engineers shrugged at like a weather forecast you don't like but have to accept. They cut the 3 seconds between 2 shots of the creek and didn't say what they thought it was. They said, "Viewers can decide." They added a lower third with the words Pine Hollow, Arkansas, and let the footage run twice, once at speed, once slowed. The anchor read from a script that tried very hard to sound amused and didn't succeed. Calvin watched from the high stool in his apartment, the television perched on a crate, antennae crooked like broken fingers. The picture came through with the usual snow, But when the creak appeared, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breath shallow. He didn't need the slow-motion replay. He had only been waiting for that half-turn, that almost glance toward the lens, that small lift of the blanket as if to keep a sleeping weight from getting wet. When it came, something loosened in him that had been cinched tight since the day he aimed a gun at Mercy and pulled the trigger. His hands shook, old habit, old guilt, then steadied on their own. He said her name once, not loud, not to be heard, just to let the room know what was true. He stopped going to the lumberyard after that. He started walking the ridge roads at dusk the way men walk themselves back to the person they were supposed to be. He picked trash out of the culverts and stacked fallen branches at the trailheads where the ruts run deep, the way he'd seen someone else stack wood with bark side down, cross-laid for air. Mary brought the journal to the county library because she had promised herself if the day ever came, when the town could listen without spitting at the teller, she would give it a place to rest that wasn't a locked drawer. She had taken the time over winter to transcribe the parts she could read without crying for too long. The pages that bore bloodstains she left as they were, because some things have to stay rough if they're going to be honest. The head librarian, a woman who taught Sunday school and kept a carton of animal crackers in her desk for kids who needed them, took the journal from Mary's hands like a sacrament. She didn't ask for provenance or permission. She said, "We'll shelve it under local histories." And then she said, "It won't gather dust here." People came in ones and twos to read it. Men who couldn't sit still through a ball game sat still with it. Women who had not cried in public since their father's funerals let the pages blur and didn't wipe the tears away until they finished a paragraph about 2 small blankets folded in a smokehouse crawl space. Teenagers who thought the town had nothing to offer them read one line, "They don't hate, they remember," and copied it on the inside of their denim jackets in Sharpie. When they returned it to the desk, they did not speak. The librarian stamped the card and smiled and watched their backs go out into a town that felt a half-inch kinder than it had the hour before. The cemetery on the hill above the high school had a marker the church ladies chipped in to buy the first year. It carried a name and 2 dates the way markers do, except the second date was the most honest thing they could think of. March 1988, last seen. People left the usual flowers at first, store-bought lilies with crepe paper dignity, plastic roses that kept their color through the heat of July. But then in late June of that 3rd year, a bouquet of wildflowers appeared. Black-eyed Susans, Queen Anne's lace, a fist of bee balm, and a single sprig of river mint. No twine held them. The stems were tucked into each other with the kind of gentle competence you see in old women who can braid in the dark, or children who have taught themselves how to make knots without a Boy Scout manual. The ground around the marker was damp, as if someone with heavy feet had stood there before dawn. The wildflowers came back the next month, and the next. In December, when the frost silvered the grass and the cans rattled down on the field below during basketball practice, there were no flowers, but someone had left a piece of cedar, the end clean cut, the smell strong enough to make the air above the stone seem warmer. Mary drove by one morning and saw it from the road, pulled over without signaling, and pressed her gloved hand flat against the stone, the way a daughter does when she doesn't have words. She didn't look over her shoulder, but she knew the hills saw her, and she hoped the forest did too. News people came once more after the footage aired. Not the crew that had seen the water. Other faces, other vans, other microphones held at angles meant to fish emotion out of a person who knows better than to give it to a stranger. They asked the sheriff for a statement. He said what you say when your job is to fact-check grief. He said there was no evidence of wrongdoing, nothing to investigate, nothing to confirm. He said the county asked hikers to respect private property, and that's all he was going to say. They asked Calvin for a quote. He closed the door without being rude, and sat on the edge of his bed until the sound of their engine left the street, and the familiar valley quiet came back like a wet dog shaking itself off at your door. The tape played on the local channel for a week, on and off, when there was time to fill between weather and high school sports. The novelty of it burned off the way morning fog does when the sun decides to take its job seriously. But every time those 3 seconds rolled, something happened you couldn't chart on a ratings report. Some people turned their heads away not because they were scared, but because they had never felt that kind of tenderness coming from the part of the world they'd been taught to fear. Others leaned close, palms on their knees, and said out loud to living rooms with no one else in them, "I knew it." In the cabin, where dust motes danced in the light that slants exactly the way Tom used to like, the chair by the window sometimes rocked when the air was still. If you stood on the porch at dusk and didn't push the door, you could smell cedar and a faint, clean scent like snow on fur. The floorboards held a stain the color of tea in the shape of a cast-iron skillet print, and even though the spring rains should have worked it loose, it held. The window latch was snipped in the way hands without keys do it, careful enough to make repair unnecessary. Someone, not a human someone, had folded the quilt at the foot of the bed into a square so precise Mary would smile every time she came to check that the roof hadn't given in. A sprig of pine appeared on the sill once, bright and wet, and the drops that fell from it were too warm to be from the rain. When the sun fell behind the western ridge in late summer and turned the trees to copper, the kind of evening light that makes even fences look forgiving, Mary stood at the bridge and listened to the water's slow talk against the rocks. She closed her eyes and felt the air shift, like a large chest filling and letting out breath very far off. Somewhere in the trees, a low sound rolled through the pines, too even to be a warning, too deep to be grief. She held the sound in her own chest for a moment and let it out. The fog didn't thicken this time. The banks held. Calvin walked the road home with his head up. He didn't count steps. He didn't ask for signs. When the wind moved through the cedars, he tilted his face to it and let it thread his hair back the way a hand might on a porch where no one needs to talk. He passed the cemetery gate and saw the month's bouquet, a little lopsided, stems muddy at one end, the kind of flaw that comes from carrying something a long way because it matters to the one you carry it for. He slipped off his hat without thinking. He didn't say he was sorry. Not out loud. He said something quieter that meant the same thing and asked for more. It would have been easy to call those 3 seconds a trick of light or a prank or a hoax if this place didn't know the difference between performance and love. Pine Hollow had never been good at faking what it felt. That was part of the problem and part of the cure. So the town did what towns do when a story moves from rumor to witness. It lowered its voice and made room. The tape didn't make the valley famous. It made it attentive. People slowed down near the bridge and drove with their lights off for a beat to see how the water looked before it remembered it was supposed to reflect. Fishermen packed out their trash. Teenagers left the cabin alone. Someone fixed the broken step without telling anybody. The librarian put a sticky note inside the journal that read, "Return this to its shelf with respect," and nobody peeled it off. Near the end of that year, just before the first frost laced the bar ditch and the deer began their cautious wanderings across the 2-lane, Mary woke in the dark to the sound of a radio, on low in a neighbor's kitchen, and the softer sound of something else she could only feel. The sensation you get when a train you can't see runs the bottom of the valley and all the windows hum in their frames. She lit a single candle and sat with it until the wick made that tiny pop that sounds like a yes. The next morning she drove up to the cabin with a thermos and a biscuit in a paper bag and stood on the porch until the sun took the chill off the boards. She said thank you into the open door. She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one she could hear. Down in town, someone replaced the bulbs in the street lights. The new ones cast a warmer cone. In that light, faces looked like themselves again. The valley had needed that. The footage played one last time on the local station in a year-end montage between a piece about the high school band and a reminder to bring pets inside when the temperature dropped. It was only 3 seconds, then 2 seconds in slow motion, barely enough to register unless you had been waiting for it. It was enough. 3 winters had passed without her. and the season learned how to carry the absence without breaking. But absence isn't the same as gone. The ones who needed to know already knew. The rest would understand in their own time or not at all. And the forest, which has never needed to prove itself to anyone, drew its line of care deeper under the roots where most people never think to look. At night, when the fog came low and the creek wore the moon like a borrowed ring, 4 shapes sometimes paused where the gravel gives way to grass on the hill by the cemetery. They stood without shifting, arms full of wildflowers, then placed them down as if setting a sleeping child into a bed. If anyone saw them, they looked away not out of fear, but out of reverence, the way you lower your eyes when Grace walks past, and you don't want to be impolite. And in the cabin where warmth still remembered names, the chair by the window rocked once more and stilled, as if someone had stood and walked toward the door with a blanket in their arms, and all the time in the world, to get where they were going. Spring arrived in 2002 like a sigh let out after too many seasons held tight in the chest. The frost gave way first in the low creases where the creek curved shallow, and then slowly up the ridge where the pines leaned into morning light. Buds pushed up through the thaw, like quiet hands reaching toward something older than the cold. And one morning, when the sun burned the mist off just enough to show the shapes beneath it, a young forest ranger stepped into a place he didn't recognize on any map. He hadn't been assigned to Pine Hollow long. The older rangers called it a dead zone, a stretch of state-owned woodland that mostly kept to itself. No campgrounds, no cabins to monitor, no posted hiking trails. Just woods. And the woods had a way of staying quiet when they wanted to. But on his map, there was a boundary that curved too perfectly, like a bubble blown out from the rest of the lines. And something about that shape made him curious. He hiked in early, boots cutting through dew that clung high on the grass. It had rained the night before, just enough to dampen the bark and swell the moss. But what caught his attention wasn't the damp. It was the warmth. A patch of air just past a fallen spruce where the light broke gold. The temperature shifted like he'd walked into a room with a fire burning. That was the moment he saw it. Not a clearing. Not exactly. More like a space the forest had agreed not to reclaim. Trees arched just far enough to let the sun through. Wildflowers leaned toward a breeze that didn't move, and in the center stood a stone. It wasn't the kind of stone left by glaciers or carved by surveyors. It was hand-cut, hand-placed, thick and broad, the kind of stone you kneel to set. The words carved into it were shallow but careful, not machine-etched. Finger-cut, blade-cut, alive. Eleanor Whitfield, loved by the wild. There was no date, no epitaph beyond that. No indication who had placed it, or when, or why the forest had not grown over it. The ranger knelt before it without meaning to. It felt like the kind of place where standing would be too loud. He reached toward the base, where moss had begun to creep across the stone's lower lip, and brushed it aside. That's when he saw the handprint. Not painted, not carved, pressed. The rock bore the imprint of something enormous. A hand wider than his chest, 5 fingers fanned gently outward, each digit thick and long, the texture of the skin embedded in the grain, like the stone had still been wet when it happened, like whoever made it had wanted to leave behind something soft and something that would outlast them. The ranger swallowed. He sat there longer than he meant to, just listening. The birds hadn't stopped singing, the leaves hadn't stopped moving, but everything felt quieter, not hushed, attentive. He stood, finally, brushing dirt from his jeans, and turned to leave. But just before he stepped back into the trees, something caught the corner of his eye. There were 4 of them, standing in the fog at the edge of the grove, tall, still, not men, not animals. Their fur hung long and coarse, but their bodies held shape like sentinels, like mourners. One of them stepped forward and knelt slowly, placing a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. Queen Anne's lace, dogwood, river mint, dandelion in bloom, all arranged without twine, the stems folded into each other in a way that spoke of memory. not ceremony. The ranger didn't breathe. They didn't look at him. And when the flowers were set, they turned together and stepped back into the fog, as if they'd never been there at all. He didn't follow. He waited until he couldn't see his own breath anymore, until the sun cleared the mist for good. Then he stepped forward again, toward the stone. Something small and silver glinted at the edge of the flowers. He knelt, carefully this time, and picked it up. It was a bracelet, simple, smooth. The kind of thing handed down, not bought. The same 3 marks etched at its center, the interwoven curves that some might mistake for vines, others for roots. He turned it over in his hand. It was warm, warmer than it should have been for something left in the morning chill. And then the wind shifted. From the trees came the scent of cedar smoke, faint, familiar, like a stove just lit for coffee. He looked up. There was no fire, no footprints, just the circle of trees and a hush that had settled in so fully it felt like prayer. He stood, held the bracelet in his palm a moment longer, then laid it gently back among the flowers. He didn't take photos, didn't make notes, didn't mark the grove on his map. Some places weren't meant to be logged. Some names weren't meant to be passed through paperwork. He stepped back into the forest, and the trees closed behind him without a sound. Pine Hollow stayed quiet that year. The stories faded like morning breath on a mirror. But there were those who remembered. The librarian kept the journal beneath the front desk now, not because she feared theft, because some books aren't meant to be shelved with the rest. The local kids whispered about it, dared each other to hike the ridge trail and find the marker. Most didn't. The ones who did came back changed, calmer, not scared, just slower in how they moved through town after. Calvin never spoke about what he'd seen. Not again, but he started carving things. Small cedar totems he'd leave at trailheads. Quiet offerings. One was a hand, broad and flat, fingers slightly curled. Another was a cabin, tiny, with a smoke wisp carved in the shape of a spiral. He never signed them. He didn't need to. Mary still visited the grave. She never took anyone with her. Each month, just before the new moon, she'd drive up the ridge, park by the footbridge, and walk the rest of the way with a fresh bouquet. Always wildflowers, never store-bought. She didn't say prayers. She didn't kneel. She just stood and let the silence hold her. Once, in early summer, she found a small woven basket beside the stone. Inside it, folded with care, was a pair of wool gloves. Hers, the left cuff still stitched with the patch she'd sewn the year Nora had fallen in the coop. They were dry, warm. She didn't take them. Just pressed her fingers to the edge of the basket and said thank you to the air. And that was enough. The forest gives back what it chooses, and when it does not explain. Years from now, someone else will find the grove. Maybe by accident, maybe by instinct. They'll stand before that stone and read those 5 words and feel something stir inside them like roots waking in spring, loved by the wild. And they'll understand, without needing to be told, that the wild remembers. It always does. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that speak the loudest. They're not written in headlines or carved in monuments, but in small acts of compassion, in silent understandings between souls that never needed words. These are the stories that take root in forgotten places, in the hush of forests and the warmth of a single porch light left on for someone who might return. They remind us that kindness does not always announce itself, and love, true love, does not demand to be seen to exist. In a world that often rushes to label what it cannot explain, some truths resist definition. There are bonds formed not through language or blood, but through instinct, mercy, and the courage to see beyond fear. And when we choose to meet the unknown not with violence, but with trust, when we extend our hands without asking for anything in return, sometimes the wild reaches back, not to harm, not to tame, but to remember. Because memory, real memory, doesn't fade when a story ends. It lingers. in the way a forest regrows where fire once took everything, in the shape of footprints washed soft by time, in gestures left behind for no one to see but someone to feel. And the greatest debts are not paid in words or wealth, but in silence, in the way someone lives their life a little gentler after being touched by something good. So if this story has stayed with you, even in a small way, let it live on. Let it soften the edges of your day. Let it remind you that even in a world full of noise, there's still room for quiet things that mean everything. And maybe, just maybe, there's a place inside all of us where the wild still remembers what it means to be seen and loved, without needing to explain why. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story moved you, we'd be honored to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below to share what stayed with you. And if you'd like to join us on more journeys like this, stories full of heart, wonder, and humanity, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel. Every voice helps keep the fire going. We'll be waiting for you right here next time